Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast at the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. Australia's food culture has undoubtedly benefited from our rich migrant story. From the ubiquitous Chinese takeaway in our country towns, Italian coffee culture and the Aussie barbecue, Australia's food culture is a fascinating reflection of our history. Of all our imported food traditions, Italian food is arguably the most popular. Joining me to discuss the history of Italian food in Australia is food historian Tania Cammarano. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Tania.
Thank you, Georgina. Happy to be here.
Oh, it's lovely to have you here. You're not just a food historian, you're also like a Italian food tour guide, aren't you? You probably have a better title than that, but you were just telling me about the wonderful tours you do around Melbourne.
Yes, so I've basically taken my research and I run walking tours of the inner city and Carlton mostly, where I try to show historical sites that really explain some of the really rich history Italian food and Italian people obviously have had in Australia, but in Melbourne specifically. And on that tour, we start at the Royal Exhibition buildings and I try to extend this idea that, or what is actually a myth, this myth that Italian food started in the 1950s with the post-World War migration, because it's much, much older than that.
Yes, we'll get on to discussing that. I mean, we should just note, for people who haven't been to the Robert Menzies Institute based here in Parkville, which is next to Carlton, we're next to the iconic Italian food street, Lygon Street.
Absolutely. And I think Melbourne University students historically have eaten Italian food perhaps before the rest of the population was eating Italian food. So I think Melbourne Uni is very much part of that story.
I should have dug out a Robert Menzies anecdote from his student days here in the early 1900s. Maybe he was frequenting Lygon Street trying some spaghetti.
Who knows?
But why do you think Italian food has been so popular in Australia? I mean, is there something about it that makes it attractive to the Australian palate historically, or it's popular all over the world, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And it's popular where there are no Italian migrants as well. So that's worth pointing out, I think. I think if you ask a historian or an academic, they'll give you a whole range of reasons, of factors. And I think some of those, they're quite material factors, things like immigration, obviously, industrialisation, increased prosperity, the media, the role of the Australian Women's Weekly, for example, in popularising foreign foods in Australia. There's this whole range of concrete or material factors that have gone into the popularity of Italian food in Australia. And there's also the qualities inherent in Italian food itself, like it's pretty easy to prepare, it's very versatile, and it's also delicious, right? So that helps. But in my research, what I've found in the spread of popularity of Italian food in particular, there are also these conceptual factors in play. And these are these ideas of Italy that have been in Australia since colonisation. What Italy has meant, imaginings of Italy, and how people think about Italy. And this has had an effect on food in Australia. And these ideas, they can be separated into sort of two distinct categories, and they go right back to colonial Australia.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've lived overseas in Japan, and that impression, that image of Italy and of France as well, in countries that are so completely different culturally, it is glamorous, it's luxurious, and it's high status. French cuisine, Italian cuisine, it's very high status. It's sort of beautiful, beautifully presented. And I was there in Japan as an Australian diplomat trying to sort of sell Australia, how to compete with those idealised versions of Italy and France when Australia's image to the Japanese, in this case, was quite different.
Yeah, I think Italians have had a long time to get that message out there, right?
They have, yes.
So I think too that when you think about Italy and Australia and what Italy has meant to Anglo-Australians, there's two very distinct periods, I think. And the first one are these ideas of a romantic Italy. And these ideas really came to Australia with the English colonists.
Yeah.
Because these ideas were already entrenched in English culture with the ideas of the Renaissance and the Romantics. And so this kind of idea that the English had of Italy as a land of culture and beauty and art, which is why they sent their descendants on the grand tours of Europe.
Yes, I was going to say they had those experiences in, is it 18th century, of the elites in Britain going on their grand tour, experiencing Italy, going to Rome, to Florence, and all those, that amazing culture, the art, the sculptures, obviously the food. those experiences are taken back to Britain, and then, of course, some of those Britons end up migrating to Australia with those ideas in place.
Absolutely. So there's a historian, Ros Pesman, who says that these ideas of Italy came to Australia in the cultural baggage of the colonists. Yes. So that elite Australia, so we are, of course, talking about a certain level.
Probably not the convicts.
No, probably not the convicts. I don't think they cared too much. But this idea that Italian art, that Italian sculpture, architecture, high Italian culture was valuable and valued by the Australian colonial elite. Yeah. Definitely. And I think even though in that period of Australian history, there's obviously, it's not that closely related to food as such. But these ideas are there that Italy has positive connotations.
Yeah, yeah.
You know? So I think that comes into play in that period. And also the actual Italian migrants that were here at that time, they were a very small group. So by 1901, there's only about 5,000 Italian migrants in Australia. And there's this perception that they are an artistic and cultured type. And if you look at some of them, there's people like civil engineer Carlo Catani. There's a lot of artists. There's surgeon and wine industry pioneer Thomas Fiaschi. There's a lot of opera singers and artists and those types of people. So there's this perception that Italians and ideas of Italy means good.
And why did those Italians come to Australia in the 19th century? Because that would have been quite unusual. As you say, there's only 5,000 and Australia's population by 1901, I'm going to scratch my head here, I think it's about 4 million or so. So they're a tiny, tiny proportion of the population.
Absolutely.
They must have had a particular reason.
So many of those types were quite the adventurers, or there was reason to come. Or Carlo Catani, for example, I was reading recently, he came via New Zealand, actually. They've just had this sense of adventure, I think, many of them. So that's that small group. And there were, of course, people that came for gold and lower class Italians, I suppose, that also came in that period. But there was this perception that they were this artistic, intellectual type of person.
And that early group of Italian migrants to Australia, were they from particular regions of Italy or just anywhere?
They were more generally from the north, I would say. And, of course, it's very different to the mass migration that happened after the Second World War, which was very much characterised by southern European migration. Yeah.
So this adventurous, possibly artistic group of Italians coming out in that 19th century period. So is that when we first start to see Italian cooking entering into Australian cuisine? Because, of course, as you were saying before, the received wisdom is that there are lots of Italians who migrate in the 1950s, particularly to Melbourne, and some to Adelaide, some to Sydney, and quite a few to Brisbane, wasn't it? And they brought with them their food culture, and the rest is history. Lygon Street kind of infiltrated the rest of Australia. But that's not quite right.
So that kind of narrative is definitely the narrative that we read about all the time in street
That's on
press.
The back of the Legos packet,
100%. So if I had $1 every time I heard how the Italians came in the 1950s with their espresso machines and their delicious sauces, and Anglo-Australians were a bit sceptical but curious, but then they tried it and then they were won over. And I think there's this great quote, the Italophile David Dale, who basically says, these Italians came and changed our culture from bland and boring, and they made the national drink cappuccino, and they made our attitude playful. I mean, that's lovely, but it's absolutely not true. So I think what you have is you have these romantic ideas of Italy. You have this perception in this early period that Italians are pretty good. They're an interesting group. They're okay. But then what you have is in the 1920s and 30s is a big increase in the Italian population. And this occurs because basically America shuts its doors to Italian migrants, and we start to see kind of manual labour jobs become available and Italian migrants here in Australia, and they go to Queensland and the sugarcane fields and Western Australia on the gold mines. And then you start to see this attitude start to change towards Italian migrants. You start to see things where they start to say, well, these Italian migrants, they're taking our jobs. You also see more southern immigrants come, and they're seen as dirty and they're not going to fit in with our way of life, but most likely they're going to steal our jobs. And they're also starting to corrupt this idea of a white Australia. So the Italian migrants always had this kind of difficult position, particularly the southern Italian migrant, in that they acceptable as migrants to Australia. I mean, they're not like Asian or anything, but they're barely acceptable. There's a quote coming from, I can't remember who, but they're called the Chinese of Europe. So they're still of Europe. No, not very nice.
No.
They're still of Europe, but they're the Chinese. And there's this great book that was actually published here at University of Melbourne by a guy called Jens Ling in 1927, and it's called Non-Britishers in Australia. And he goes through all the different migrant groups and points out their good bits and their bad bits. And this book and the attitudes in this book sum up, I think, the Australian experience of Italians in that time. And he says that the northern Italians are pretty good, but the southern Italians, there's a quote along the lines of their blood has been impoverished by Africa and Asia, and they're not that great. And really, we just want the northerners. We don't want the southerners. And he then goes on to say that while the northern Italians are okay, an average Australian can't tell a northerner from a southerner.
Right.
So according to them, an Italian's going to lower the social tone.
I see.
So you start to see this shift in attitudes towards Italian migrants, and it's never universally negative. I want to point that out too. There's always more welcoming voices for Italians in Australia, but certainly in the 20s and the 30s. And then, of course, you have the war, and that's when attitudes really start to harden towards Italian migrants in Australia.
Were the Italians bringing some of their northerner versus southerner prejudices with them? Was that coming from within the community, or was that something that Europeans, or I guess British, had observed in Italy and made it their own judgments, and then that was imported?
Well, I think in Italy, definitely the southern question is a big deal. So it's always existed in Italy. So they would have been exposed to these ideas in Italy itself. But I think here, this was really just based on looks. I mean, the northern Italian is stereotypically blonde, is tall. The southerner is short, is dark. So I think it's really around racism and just what it looked like.
Just appearance.
Yeah. Which Anglo-Australians had absorbed these attitudes that were prevalent in Italy too. It's not like they weren't.
The introduction of pasta into Australia comes really early. I mean, it's in the 1800s. You're seeing pasta referred to in cookery books. I think you write about Australia's first ever cookery book by Edward Abbott, the English and Australian cookery book. And there's even a reference to pasta in that.
There is.
Is that coming from Britain, do you think? So Britons are experiencing pasta in Italy, taking it back to Britain and then bringing it to Australia? Is that sort of a...
Yes and no. So I didn't say this before, but you asked me when Italian cooking kind of starts in Australia. Well, you've always got Italian ingredients pretty much from the 1830s in Sydney. You can buy pasta, you can buy olive oil, you can buy Parmesan cheese. Melbourne, it's a little later, the 1850s. So there's ingredients are there, and pasta is a good one to think about because pasta's coming in that English tradition. So the colonists bring their Mrs. Beeton cookbook, their Eliza Acton, and if you look in these English books, you do see pasta recipes. I mean, they're sort of weird pasta recipes. There's things like the macaroni pudding, which I don't know, Georgina, if you're familiar with the macaroni pudding.
I'm not. Do tell.
So this is pasta that it's cooked in milk generally. It is a custardy thing, baked in the oven, and then sometimes it's got jam on it. It's got a bit of nutmeg, like a rice pudding, but with pasta.
Oh, sounds quite nice.
Well, I've made it with my students before, and it's not as bad as you think it is. A bit stodgy, but that's all right. Now, this is in Mrs. Beeton books, and this is in the English cookbooks. And if I tell an Italian there's this recipe and it's got sugar and milk and pasta's cooked for ages, they're just disgusted. But actually, if you go back to the Renaissance in Italy, pasta was cooked with milk and sugar. And this is where that's gone to England, that tradition of cooking pasta in that way. So it does come from Italy. It's just that by the 1800s, the Italians have moved on. They've added sauce. They're not cooking pasta in that way anymore. But the English are still doing it, and then the English bring it here, right? So macaroni puddings you can see in Australian cookbooks right up until the 1950s.
And then what happens to them?
They kind of disappear. And
people go off them.
Well, I think a few things happen in that attitudes towards dessert in Australia change. We've got refrigeration. We also know more about vitamins and things like that. So we start to think, well, maybe we should be having lighter desserts. Maybe we should be having more fruit. And then, of course, there is the Italian influence of pasta being cooked in a certain way that has nothing to do with milk and sugar and this kind of thing. So a number of things come together so that when you look at, because one of the things I have done, which was a good fun time, let me tell you, was I looked at pasta in 100 popular Australian cookbooks from 1864 to 1975. So I ended up with this sample of 1,000 so pasta recipes to look at how pasta was used in Australia and how much of the influence was Italian. And in the end, I sort of concluded that actually in the 50s and beyond, I mean, what I did find was that there are very early Italian pasta recipes. In fact, in 1895, there is a pasta recipe, a fresh vermicelli recipe. So actually fresh pasta in Mrs. Rawson's book of 1895, which most people are quite surprised when I say that these recipes exist.
And in Mrs. Rawson's book, does she refer to being Italian, or
No.
it's just, this is just how you cook this dish made out of wheat.
Because she's actually already reflecting how pasta is used in the English cookbooks.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this more English tradition of cooking pasta, but it gradually changes. And there are foreign recipes in those books as well. So some of the early Italian-ish recipes in Australian cookbooks, I can think of some off the top of my head. In 1900, in Zara Ronson's book, there's a recipe for what she calls rizzoletti, but are really arancini. There's risotto milanese in the Kookaburra Cookery book of 1912. And there's little recipes along the way. Of course, cuisine absorbs foreign influence all the time.
Yeah.
So this Italian influence has already gone into those English books. It's come over here. They're anglicized versions of Italian recipes, or pasta's gone in a different direction, which it did. But in this massive sample of pasta recipes I was talking about, there's pasta recipes in nearly every single one of those books. Only 4 didn't have them. But they're not pasta recipes that you would recognize as Italian generally. But there are some, and they increase. As you can imagine, once you get over the 50s, you start to see more and more pasta recipes that we would recognize as Italian dishes as such.
Yeah, they have more connection to traditional Italian cuisine rather than co-opting the pasta to then fit in with a recipe that potentially is more traditionally British.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of the beautiful thing about food, right? It can be whatever you need it to be.
That's true.
So we can all be culinary purists like my father and insist that certain things be done certain ways. But actually, that's the beauty of food, that it changes, that it's versatile, that it reflects what's going on.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, the best report card of a dish is, did you like it or not? I mean, if you just because it was traditional and someone cooked it 400 years ago and you're still cooking it the same way, if it's not very nice, why bother? Change it.
Good point.
Tell me about the Italian restaurants that were around it was really the early 20th century, wasn't it? You start seeing Italian restaurants here in Melbourne.
Here in Melbourne primarily, but there were in other cities as well. So I guess if we go back to, so this again speaks to how there was Italian food prior to the 1950s. I recently found a reference to an Italian restaurant at 130 Spring Street in Melbourne in 1854.
Oh, what's there now, do you know?
I don't know what's there now. I don't know anything about it except it's called the Italian Restaurant and it's 1854.
It's clear,
and
clear
that was incredible. By the 1890s, there's a restaurant called Fasoli's on Lonsdale Street, and that's a very big, prominent restaurant. And it really attracted the bohemian crowds, and that was run by a guy called Vincent Fasoli, who was Swiss-Italian. And the Swiss-Italians have had actually a lot to do with Italian food because the first pasta maker was Swiss-Italian in the 1850s, Pietro Lucchini in the Hepburn Springs area. But for Soli's, you could get dishes like ossobuco. Again, I think the risotto milanese, mortadella, said to be made from horse meat, whether it was or not. But there are lots of description of Fasoli's that we have, so we have some idea of what went on there.
And what was the reception to Fasoli's at the time?
Oh,
you said it's bohemian. So was it that group of Melburnians who were going there and then maybe sort of more conservative types would never go there? Is that the impression?
That's the impression that I get, that it was writers, that it was artists, that type of person, that they drank red wine and that they have lived this good life. So your average suburban mum and dad is obviously not going there.
Poor things.
I know.
Missing out.
They had to wait a bit to get into the whole Italian restaurant thing. But then you have the restaurants in Melbourne that emerge in the 20s and 30s. So as more Italian migrants come to Australia, you see some of them set mostly in sort of the theatre district of Melbourne. And there's 5 big families, and those families were later christened the Spaghetti Mafia. And they're a really interesting group. And if you look at them and what came out from them, like the waiters and the chefs and whatever, their tentacles are spread all over the city. And even now, if you look at Grossi Florentino, so Grossi Florentino was originally the Florentino Cafe, and that was from Rinaldo Massoni, who was one of the original Spaghetti Mafia guys. So, in the 20s and 30s, you have all these restaurants popping up in Melbourne. And they were popular, again, more amongst the politicians and businessmen and higher class.
But then they're opinion leaders, right? So they're the people who are being reported on in press, on radio when we start to get radio. So in actual fact, those impressions would have been permeating suburban society, even if it wasn't necessarily where everyday Australians were going.
Yeah, that's right. And so even though not everybody was eating in those restaurants, but there was a certain awareness that these restaurants, that these wine bars, that they existed. And it kind of filters down, right? So Yeah, we didn't have the internet then, so it wasn't as
no, but we read.
wasn't as fast.
We read a lot more.
We read more things. Yes.
So, what is your sense of the food? I guess pre-1950s or even in 1950s. I mean, there's this common idea that Australian food only really improved with multiculturalism in the sort of 60s and 70s, and finally we didn't have the meat and three veg and very bland, monotonous food that is associated with our history. But do you think that's true, or do you think we're just trying to impose a 2024 palette on what meal we would have got in 1950 and you're just a different person then?
So first of all, I don't think it was as bland or as boring or as unimaginative as we like to say now. And we know that there was lots of foreign influence because it was in cookbooks. There were these restaurants, and of course there were Chinese restaurants, there were Greek-run restaurants, there were French restaurants, continental restaurants, German restaurants. So there was lots of different options. Even though, and I guess I want to stress this, they were not everyday, they were not common as such.
No.
They were not, most people were eating meat and three veg. However, if you look at cookbooks and things like that, you can see that actually Australian cooks, and this is something that Barbara Santich, who I guess is the preeminent food historian, culinary historian in Australia, has pointed out, that Australian cooks were really inventive and creative. And yes, Australian cooks did value good plain cooking, but there was a lot of creativity in that. And she points out the canon of cakes, especially, and desserts and that thing that Australian cooks produced showed that they were creative. And even in pasta recipes, some of the recipes I came across, I was like, who would have thought to do that? One of them off the top of my head was called macaroni cutlets. And they got macaroni and they cooked it till, I didn't say it was good. They cooked it till it was very soft, and then they mashed it up and they put some egg and they put some other things in there, and then they crumbed it, and then they added an uncooked macaroni and stuck it on the side like the cutlet bone, and then they fried it. And so that's pretty creative, really, isn't it?
It is creative.
I don't know if it's that tasty.
It would have been a lot of macaroni, but anyway, a lot of carbs.
But there you go. Carb on carb action. I have noted a lot of that in old cookbooks.
So one of the things that is important in the development of Italian food in Australia is this sort of industrialisation of food, isn't it? And you've looked at the example of the Perfect Cheese Company. What a name.
The Perfect Cheese Company. So the Perfect Cheese Company is a really interesting case study I think if you go through their history, it kind of explains how Australian palates have changed, but also the role of Italian migrants and how that role is not at all passive. It is not at all about these Italian migrants came with their food and these Anglo-Australians discovered it as such.
Yes, there's sort of this idea that the Cammaranos moved in next door. They had their little garden and tomatoes and basil and the like, and we were looking across the fence and smelling their yummy food, and then maybe one day we dared to try it and we dared to talk to them, and then look, suddenly now we're cooking spaghetti bolognese too.
Yeah, and absolutely. I get quite passionate about that whole narrative. But I mean, yes, on a micro level, yes, those interactions absolutely happen. Like just thinking about it, we made sauce, that whole traditional looking for Ali Barani thing of making sauce, and we had these Australian neighbours and they had beer bottles, and we had this cultural exchange where they gave us the bottles to put the sauce in and then we gave them the sauce. So I'm not saying that didn't happen, but what I do think is that Italian migrants in the food industry and others in the food industry as well that were not Italian migrants, not that it was just Italian migrants pushing Italian food, they really adapted and changed and pushed their food into the mainstream. So to go back to the Perfect Cheese Company, it was started by Natale and Maria Italiano in 1930, very close to here, their original factory in 1935. So they were originally in Peel Street, and they'd made ricotta and pecorino in their backyard and sold at the Queen Victoria Market. And they were really selling a taste of home to the Italian migrants. But their first factory, which still stands, but I bet it won't be there much longer, is on the corner of Capel and Queensbury, which is a stone's throw from here. And they made their cheese and they sold it to the Italian migrants, very small community at that time in 1930. But very quickly by 1937, they were already making feta and caseri and cheeses, so Greek cheeses to the Greek migrants. Of course, Natale was from Calabria. His family were cheesemakers, but he wouldn't have known how to make feta. So he came here and very quickly he's decided, I better make feta for the Greeks. They're there. I'll figure it out, right? So it's kind of this entrepreneurial spirit that really you can see in this company, and they very quickly grow. So in the 30s, though, nobody cares about their cheese. There's no record of them in the archives, in the dairying division archives. It's quite possible that they were making cheese illegally because at that time in Australia, or in Victoria anyway, if you were making cheese from milk that was not yours, you needed a cheese license. And there's no record of them having a cheese license.
Right.
To be fair to them, the archives are incomplete. So maybe that piece of paper wasn't there. But So they were in the Italian press and they were very much marketing to migrants. But in the 1950s, you start to see this change in the way that the Perfect Cheese Company is thought of. And you start to see them in the pages of the dairying division. And all of a sudden you see that Natalia and Maria are pushing their cheese into the mainstream. And they're doing this by having partnerships with the Australian Cheese Board, by being in trade magazines. They produce a silver anniversary booklet in 1956 that is published in both Italian and English. So straight away now, you're starting to see that, hey, we want to go after the mainstream market. We want them to know about our cheese. They really didn't know about their cheese, though, because in the 30s, etc., there was only one cheese that mattered in Australia, and that was cheddar. There was really nothing else. The cheese that the Italianos made was categorized as fancy cheese.
Right.
Which I love that moniker, fancy cheese.
Just one category.
Fancy cheese. And in fact, if you wanted to enter your cheese at the Royal Melbourne Show, there was no category up until in 1952 that you could enter it into. There was only different types of cheddar categories.
All right.
In 1952, they have the first fancy cheese category. And the Italianos win it with their cheese because there's not really that many others. Although in the 50s, there are a lot of companies.
So a fancy cheese was Parmesan,
was everything,
mozzarella, feta.
Everything that wasn't cheddar.
Right. Okay. Wow. So even Dutch sort of Gouda,
yes.
Edam, those types of things. Oh,
so this is in Australia. Yes, absolutely. And in 1952 and beyond 1952, you start to see a proliferation of all the different categories in the agriculture shows. And that really shows how the cheese world is changing. But in the 1950s, we start to see this shift in this catalogue that they produce, which actually has portraits of Natalia Maria done by Helmut Newton, the fashion photographer who was in Melbourne at that time. I know, right? It's crazy.
Wow.
It's like, wow, that's really weird. But you start to see that they're pushing into the mainstream. There is an introduction in this book written by the director of the dairying division, basically saying Natalia Italiano is amazing. And then they have an Italian foreword, which I just have to mention this. They got a parish priest to write that because that's what you do if you're Italian, because that's the person that's going to say the best things about you. But they really start to push their cheese into the mainstream. And at that point, now when they started, there were nearly no Italians. At that point in the 50s, where they lived, Fitzroy, the factory eventually moves to Fitzroy, they really could have just marketed to Italian migrants and had a very successful business. But they push into the mainstream and they eventually become the 6th largest cheese manufacturer in Australia. And they do heaps of innovative stuff, like they're the first company to actually produce sheep's milk cheese in Australia, which nobody else had done. I mean, I know sheep for cheese is different to sheep for agricultural purposes, but still they're the first to do this. And they really push themselves out into the mainstream. So by the 1970s, Natalia Italiano is actually used as a poster boy by the Department of Foreign Affairs to attract migrants to Australia.
Wow.
And his cheese, which was once fancy cheese and we don't really care, is celebrated, and you start to have all these kind of workshops around produced by the government about how do we make more ethnic cheese. It's changed to ethnic cheese by the 70s.
So everyone's going to ask, what happened to the Perfect Cheese Company? Was it taken over or does it still,
it does. Well, Perfect Italiano, which people that go to the supermarket is Perfect Cheese.
Oh.
Well, but in 1981, they sold the company to the first of a number of multinationals. So it was Unigate in 1981. And it's still Perfect Cheese Company till around 96. And this again tells the story of Italian migrants. In 96, Bonlac, another multinational, takes it over and they change the name from Perfect Cheese Company to Perfect Italiano. Because why? By 1990s, it's pretty cool to be Italian, especially connected with food, that idea that it's authentic, that it's real. But of course, in 1930, why did Natalia call it the Perfect Cheese Company? Why didn't he give it an Italian name? I'd say because in the 30s, not a great time to fly your Italian flag.
No. So tell me about that time for Italians, leading up to World War II and then, of course, during World War II. It's not a great time to be an Italian in Australia.
No, it's really not. So we talked about how earlier those Italian migrants were seen in a positive light. Then it starts to shift in the 20s and 30s with those more manual labour migrants possibly taking Australian jobs, that whole rhetoric. In the 30s, things get quite bad because obviously the war is coming. Italy's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 is seen in a very bad way in Australia. And there's starting to be real suspicions about these Italian migrants and what exactly they're up to. And so, of course, when the war comes, lots of Italians are interned and attitudes towards Italians. There is this real fear that there's a fifth column, that they're spies, that they're enemies of Australia, that there's a lot of surveillance, whatever, and nothing is ever found that supports any of that. but they were real fears, definitely. So the Italian migrant becomes shunned. And one of the interesting things that's produced in this period is this cookbook that I found that was published in 1937. And obviously listeners can't see it, but I've got a copy of it in front of me.
Yeah, it does look pretty cool. Yeah.
This book is produced by a group of Italian migrants called Australia's first continental cookery book. And it's published in 1937 by a group of Italian migrants who are very strongly linked with fascism. And these Italians, they initially published a newspaper in Australia called Il Giornale Italiano, which is seen as a fascist newspaper. And in fact, it's when Italy invades Ethiopia that the Australian publisher of that paper doesn't want to publish it anymore for obvious reasons. So this is when they decide to set up their own publishing company, the Cosmopolitan Publishing Company, which not only publishes the newspaper, but starts to publish a whole range of publications that are really all designed to teach Anglo-Australians about the value and worth of Italians and Italian cultural products. So there's books about Italian music, books about Italian language, and of course this cookbook. Now, Georgina, you might notice it never says it's an Italian cookbook.
No, it's continental.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And there's no Italian author on it. There's no author on it at all. So how do I know that it's an Italian cookbook I'll tell you in a second. But the reasons for that, I think, is because it's 1937. Nobody's going to pick up a book that's Italian.
No.
There's not really going to fly. It's
Yeah.
absolutely subversive. And it's really got this message in this book that Australians eat way too much meat and potatoes. They need to eat more fish, more vegetables, and basically they need to eat like Italians. And that's the way forward.
We're still being told that, aren't we? We're still being told the Mediterranean diet's the way to go. So,
But if I can read like a little bit of the introduction, it says, it's time for Australians to realise, in fact, that what one may call Mediterranean cookery has much to offer them. Italian cookery, for instance, embodies ideas, aims and methods that have not only been ripening for literally thousands of years, but have been doing so under climatic conditions far more closely resembling those of Australia than do the British. Then elsewhere it says, one keen ambition of the Continental Cookery Book is to flash a ray or two of light onto the occasionally somewhat obscure recesses of traditional British cookery. Not for a moment that the latter has no merits, but that so many of its good points are unsuitable or only half suited to Australian conditions. Also says, French cookery is practically an offshoot of the Italian. British cookery, with all its merits, can boast no such illustrious pedigree. It is only common sense, then, for Australians to avail themselves of what, in the very nature of things, must offer them most valuable and interesting examples of food preparation. To ignore such a mine of information is not merely to confess, but to cherish one's own ignorance.
Wow.
So this book is very much about Australians don't know how to eat. You need to eat like us.
It's extraordinary. So written by Italian migrants.
Yeah, published by the Cosmopolitan Publishing Company. I've obviously looked into that company and what else they published. They were fascist. They were all interned during the war. The company shut down. But they really were trying to, as they say, build a bridge between Australians and Italians.
And was this book popular? Did this do well?
It's hard to tell because it's not like there's bestseller lists in the 1930s. But it was advertised and reviewed in The Age, in the Sydney Morning Herald and in the Brisbane paper. So it was definitely widely available. There are, that I know of, 6 copies. There was also an Italian version published. The Italian version, there's only 1 copy of that I know of. So I think it was sufficiently widespread. I think it stood no chance of its message being heeded in 1937, but a lot of the things that it said have actually come true. We do think like that now. And some of the recipes in there, you've got recipes for lasagna, you've got recipes for pizza, you've got recipes for a whole range of Italian dishes that in 1937 you wouldn't think would be in this cookbook, tortellini, et cetera, except it's really clever in that it doesn't call them those things because, of course, nobody would have known what they were talking about. So I think lasagna recipe is something like Genoese ribbon macaroni because it's a lasagna with pesto. And the pizza recipe is just called a Neapolitan recipe.
Right.
But it's pizza.
Yeah.
So I think this book, it's sort of utopian literature because these Italian migrants have gone, we're not valued in Australia. We're not understood in Australia. This is what we want. We want this world where you eat foods from all different countries, primarily Italy, because we have this knowledge and we want to share it with you. But it's lovely too in that it's still very, very positive about Australian produce, and the possibilities for Australian cuisine.
And it's written in a really engaging, approachable style. It sounds very Australian of that era, doesn't it? So,
yeah, it's very different to any other cookbook of that period.
Yeah.
Like if you read those, this one's actually, there's really funny lines in it. There's one about, it's not nice, but it's funny. Lamb in a hurry. To start with, it must be real lamb, not mutton rejuvenated like ambitious ladies on the wrong side of 40.
Oh, dear. Wow. Cutting.
Yes. So even though I don't know who wrote it, I strongly suspect I know who wrote it. And he was a guy who was editor of the newspaper. His name was Franco Battisteza. And I am hoping, very much hoping, that I'm going to meet with his son in the near future and see if I can get some more information.
Maybe find something in the paper
to work out if it's him.
So this cookbook, I mean, fascinating, not least for its links to fascism within Australia, but how it's portraying Italian food and trying to democratise it in a very difficult political climate for Italians. But what was really, really influential in the 50s, of course, was the Australian Women's Weekly. And it's incredible to read about how the Australian Women's Weekly was introducing the glamorous side of Italy with all this influx of migrants from Italy who were perhaps perceived less glamorously. As you say, they tended to be coming from the southern part of Italy, tended to be less educated and certainly not bringing that Gucci, Milanese, Florentine impression with them. But the Australian Women's Weekly does quite an amazing job of glamorising Italy and Italians, presumably in an effort to help introduce all these new migrants, new Australians to the Australian population.
I don't know if that's the reason.
Yeah.
I do think the Australian Women's Weekly was very influential. And I do think that they traded on these ideas of glamorous Italy. So remember I talked about the romantic Italy period.
Yeah.
So once we get to the 50s, you start to see these ideas that, so we've gotten through the horrible war years for Italian migrants in Australia. Now we're in the sort of post-war period. And Italian food is definitely becoming more popular now because of things like the Weekly as well. And I think it's more related to these ideas of glamorous Italy than it is related to the fact that there are more Italian migrants here.
But do you think there's not a curiosity within the Australian public, Australian housewives reading the Australian Women's Weekly, that they want to understand who these people are? And then you have the Women's Weekly saying, look, we're going to have an Italian fashion parade and we're going to bring them around the country. I mean, it was amazing reading, this isn't the Women's Weekly, but reading about David Jones' Italian Festival in 1966, so a bit later, which featured a 16-foot, 1-ton plaster replica of Michelangelo's David.
Yeah, they had to pull apart the Sydney building to get it in there. I think what the Weekly was very much involved with, so in the 1950s, you've got these ideas of glamorous Italy start to kind of permeate, and they're really spread by, whereas romantic Italy is spread by high Italian culture and literature, etc. Glamorous Italy is really spread by popular culture that emerges in Italy and Italian cultural products. So an Italian design becomes this kind of embodiment of glamour, really. And it's reflected in Italian movies made in Italy, Hollywood movies made in Italy. So 3 Coins in the Fountain and Roman Holiday and all that. American stars going to Italy, living in Rome, Ava Gardner and Liz Taylor, wearing Italian fashion. And all of this is written about in places like the Weekly. So Italy becomes like this source of glamour. And what the Weekly does is they use that glamour to market Italian food as such. And also more generally, just this idea that Italy is a glamorous thing and Australian housewives should be sophisticated. And they do bring out these Italian fashion models in 1955. And they're these 4 Italian models. They come to Australia with the Weekly partners with the different department stores in each city, David Jones and Myer in Melbourne, David Jones in Sydney. But they go everywhere. They even go to, I think they go to Wagga Wagga from memory. I don't know why that stood out to me. But anyway. And the press lose their mind over these women. They're on the front of the Weekly. They got their elegant jackets. They got their gloves and there's lots of talk about them. And they have these fashion parades. And at these fashion parades, they are served Italian food. They have Italian music. They're designed in, like they have sets that resemble Florence's Pitti Palace where fashion parades are shown. Like they sound amazing. And the Weekly reports on it. All the newspapers report on it. And they even include recipes from the Italian models who they talk about as this epitome of glamour and sophistication. Australian women could really learn from us, this whole thing that goes on. And Italian food is very much part of that idea of glamour and fashion. And what's interesting to me is how this is the period in which more and more Italian migrants are coming. And they are divorced from that.
Yeah.
So,
and how can that be? I mean, it just seems so hypocritical.
Yeah, right. It's like the paradox at the heart of everything I research is how can Italian food be seen as glamorous and sophisticated while these Italian migrants are coming and they're really seen in a very poor light? There's this amazing article that was published just a year before the fashion parades in 1954. It's got a really stark contrast between the way those models were treated and the way these Italian women, potential migrants. So I think it's in the Sun Herald, and a journalist is on some boat that's coming over to Australia, and he talks about the female migrants in particular, female Italians on this ship. And he says they are inappropriately passionate. They had to be ordered to wash at night. We can't assimilate these kind of people. We need to be careful. And there's this really strong contrast between ideas of Italy as epitomized by those glamorous models and actual Italian migrants themselves. And I think Italian food in that period is very much attached to the ideas of glamour, because you've got those fashion parades, you've got David Jones doing these food festivals, and then you've got companies like Legos, for example, which Legos, not Italian at all, started.
Yeah, so this is, I mean, you talk about cultural appropriation. So this is an incredible story, and I just don't think people would have any idea. I mean, I think of Legos, Dolmio.
Authentico.
Yes, Authentico. Yeah, tell us about Legos.
Yeah, so Legos is not Italian at all. It was started by a Cornish migrant, Henry Madron Lego, in the 1890s in Bendigo. They made tomato kind of preserves and sauces, jams, a whole range of different products in Bendigo. And in the early period, there's a couple of Legos cookbooks out there, and they're about fruit and being healthy, and very much talked about their local Bendigo tomatoes and nothing to do with Italy. Then all of a sudden in the 50s, you start to see that they are producing the tomato paste, and the can has Italian language on it, and it all seems to be very Italian. And you're like, whoa, what's going on here? And there is this shift. They make a conscious shift to present themselves as Italian, but they're never Italian. And they start to associate.
It's a marketing opportunity of the 50s.
Yes. So they see two things. So they see that there are an increasing Italian market for a start. So Italian housewives themselves will need tomato paste. But they also see that Italian food is becoming popular, and we can market this to Anglo-Australian housewives. And we'll do it by seeming to be Italian. And they just get more and more Italian by the minute they do. So 1975, they produced an Italian cookbook where if you looked at it, you'd think they were Italian. And then in 78, talk about glamour and Italian food, they have Gina Lollobrigida come out, and the ads, she's in this gold sequins dress. And honestly, she looks like she's never been, let alone in a kitchen in Australia. And there's a can that's superimposed, so she's not holding the can or anything. And these ads run in the weekly and in newspapers. And she says, when I'm in Australia, I always use Legos tomato paste. And so there's this real association with glamour and Italian food. And we see that too with other Italian personalities, especially Sophia Loren is another one. I mean, if you Google Sophia Loren and food, you'll be inundated. I mean, she's written 2 cookbooks. She famously said, although she's later said she didn't say, that everything you see here she owes to spaghetti. And she even made a 1971 film called La Mortadella, which is about an Italian woman who smuggles in mortadella to New York for her American lover. And the poster, though, it's renamed Lady Liberty in Australia. I haven't seen this movie. I've been trying to see this movie. The poster is Sophia Loren dressed as a Statue of Liberty, and she's got spaghetti for her torch, and she's got an armful of small goods. And it's like, of course, Italian food is going to absorb these sort of glamorous connotations.
So, Tania, tell me, how do we get to the stage? I mean, clearly we are today. I mean, Italian migrants in Australia, you wouldn't even blink twice. Our Prime Minister is the son of Italian migrant. You don't think that Albanese is particularly an Italian name. It's just a name. Your last name is a name. Totally and utterly accepted, part of Australian society. How did we go from having this disconnect where we saw Italian culture and food as glamorous and high value, but Italian people in Australia, migrants in Australia, as disassociated from that and actually somewhat outcast to today? How does that trajectory connect, or does it never connect?
No, it connects, I think. I think what happens is Australia starts to change. I mean, I think that the end of the White Australia policy, and even before the end of the White Australia policy, you start to see initially there are these attitudes that Italians should assimilate, and nowhere is that better summed up in the 1957 book, They're a Weird Mob by Nino Culotta, who's actually James O'Grady, that basically says, become like an Australian and you will be happy, and just be like them and you'll be great and everything will be bonza. I shouldn't say bonza, but anyway. So you have these ideas of assimilation, but even as Australia's multicultural makeup starts to change, there's this idea perhaps that we shouldn't actually erase our cultural heritage. We should start to embrace people from elsewhere and let them express their culture however they need to express their culture. And I think for the Italians, what happened was a few things. The upward mobility, the success of Italians in Australia, absolutely. The upward mobility of the next generations of Italians. But I think too, once you get to the end of the White Australia policy and you start to see other migrants come in who are more culturally distant than Italians were, you see Italians start to be embraced as the focus moves towards, well, we shouldn't have Asians or we shouldn't have Africans or we shouldn't have these other cultural groups. So Italians move, I mean, it sounds horrible, but they kind of move up that pole to the point where they are described as the exemplar minority community. In terms of food and how Italian migrants and Italian food kind of come together, we talked about this glamorous Italy where Italian migrants are quite separate. As we move along, so in the 70s, you start to see cookbooks from Australian Women's Weekly and Margaret Fulton that fully embrace Italian food in the 70s. In the 80s, you start to get a lot of Italian migrant chefs, mostly 80s and 90s, where Italian chefs are producing all this sort of food. But there's this change in attitude around what food should be. And I like to call this next period this idea of authentic Italy, where food practices by Italian migrants start to be seen as actually really good things to do, to be close to your food, to know where your food comes from, to make tomato sauce from scratch. Like these become valued and Italian migrants become bearers of this. So there's this real coming together of ideas of Italy where now authentic Italy is a good thing, also bound up with ideas of slow food, which is an Italian invented thing, I guess. That's good to be slow around your food and eat in a certain way. And so Italian migrants become very associated with being authentic bearers of food. And you can see this in Italian cookbooks. There's a few that are migrant produced that, like one off the top of my head that I can think of is Mangia Mangia, which is written by Italian migrants, was a big publishing success, or the children of Italian migrants, and really celebrates that cultural connection to food, that kind of, I guess, peasant connection to food. So I think they all sort of come together.
Yeah. So
Italian migrants become more acceptable, but also the way they are with food becomes zeitgeist. It becomes how we all want to be with food.
And that expectation in the 50s that migrants assimilate into Australian society, there was also the converse that Australians were getting to know and assimilating to a more multicultural society. So Australians were changing as much as the migrants that they welcomed were changing. And as you say, as we got more used to Italians and newer migrants came in, the Italians became actually that we know them.
Yes.
They're unremarkable.
Yep.
The new ones, well,
we'll worry about them.
We'll worry about them instead.
So I think that's what happened. Yeah.
Oh, Tania, this has been an absolutely delightful conversation, and clearly I need to book in one of your walking tours around Melbourne, and particularly one that involves an eating aspect as well.
They all involve eating aspects.
Excellent.
Yes, definitely.
Well, we'll make sure we put the link to that in our show notes so that others can also find you and enjoy that experience. But thank you so much for talking to us today about the history of Italian food in Australia.
Thank you. It was lovely. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.